Hello, welcome to our Fireside chat for September. For those of you that are new to either our design of experiments courses on Coursera or to the Fireside chat, this is something that I do on a monthly basis. We usually try to schedule them for the second Wednesday in the month, and I always have a guest speaker, and we talk about specific topics. The guest speaker usually has an interesting presentation on application of design of experiments concepts. We've been doing these fireside chats since the very beginning of the course, and I've enjoyed them greatly. And we always record them and we post them to the Coursera course. They're in the resource tab of your course. So you can not only watch this one, but you can watch all of the others if you would like. And I hope you will go back and look at them, because there's some really fascinating speakers and topics that have come up in the fireside chats. Okay, a little bit of just a reminder of how we want to try to run things. Please keep your mic muted and your cameras off during the session. The way we run this is the guest has about the first 30 minutes or so of the fireside chat, and then we open it up to questions. And we usually have some questions that are submitted in advance, and we'll talk about those. You can submit a question to either me or our guest speaker, and the best way to do that is to use the chat function on your Zoom menu. You don't need to wait until the Q&A begins. You can type in your question. You can submit it at any time during the session. If your question doesn't get answered during the hour that we've set aside for this, we will respond to it off camera and get that answer back to you. As long as you're enrolled in Coursera, we can make that happen pretty easily. I want to introduce my guest for today, Dr. Jim Simpson. Jim is an analyst, a coach, an instructor, and trainer in design of experiments and statistical methods. He has his own consulting business at JK Consultants. He's retired Air Force officer. He was on the faculty of the Air Force Academy and Florida State University. He's an adjunct at the University of Florida and the Air Force Institute of Technology. He previously has been an editor of quality engineering, and he's served on the ASQ Publications Management Board. He's a fellow of ASQ, and he was my PhD student in industrial engineering here at Arizona State University. Full disclosure, he's a former student. And I really enjoyed having Jim as a student because like most Air Force officers, he's a skilled golfer. And so he greatly encouraged me to play golf when he was a student. And the last year that he was working on his dissertation was a year that I was on sabbatical. And so we played a lot of golf, but he somehow still managed to get the dissertation done. So not only is he a good golfer, but he's a really great scholar in the area of experimental design. And I'm really pleased to have him come and give a presentation today. And this is a really fascinating topic. I've been through his slides, and I'm really anxious to see what he's going to say about this, because it's an extremely interesting, complex, and real problem. So, Jim, you are on stage if you are ready to go.
His camera's off.
Mute audio. How are we doing in terms of technology and being able to see and hear? Okay.
It's good on my end.
Okay, and it says I'm sharing my screen, but I don't see that nice green banner around it. So can you all see the slides as well?
Yes, I can.
Okay. All right, wonderful. So thank you, Doug. Yes, full disclosure, I was your student. We won't say how many years ago, but it was a little while ago. And yeah, what a great experience that was, and really prepared me nicely to go out and try to deal with real world problems that we start with the basics and the fundamentals in terms of what's in the textbook. That has served us well over many a decade of practice and implementation. But from time to time, we tend to find situations where either it's more complex, there's more to it than that. And that's really what I want to talk about today is one particular area where we want to apply experimental design for test and evaluation. As you see there, this is a military case study. So much of my work over the years has been associated with the military, Air Force, all the services. The example we're going to be looking at today is a Navy example. And just props, first of all, to my colleagues, Jim Wozowski and Luis Cortez, a couple of gentlemen I've been working with over the last 10 or 15 years. Jim was one of the...
Jim Wisnowski is going to be a guest on an upcoming Fireside Chat.
Right. Yeah. So that's coming up in what, December, maybe?
December, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then Luis and I have worked together. He was actually one of my PhD students, did his work in second order split plot designs. So I mentioned that because that's one of the topics for today's discussion as well. So again, anything you see good in this presentation, it's their work. Let's go ahead and get into this, starting with, if I can get some advancement here, sort of caging the problem and making sure we understand what we were up against. And then right after this, the next slide is the example problem. But what ends up happening in acquisition of Department of Defense or military programs is that the program itself is king. The program, whatever that program is essentially worried about itself and making it sure it gets through acquisition. And there's really two phases of testing that takes place: the developmental testing and then the operational testing. And then after that, if success is happening, then it gets fielded. So, but the programs, they sort of like to work in isolation, when in fact the systems that they're working on need to be integrated as a whole. And so this was a step, hopefully, in that right direction, where we're trying to integrate them earlier on and get a better handle of what's going on. So they needed an experimental design approach that included multiple systems for simultaneous testing. And you see down at the bottom, there's some related technologies. Many of those are centric to software intensive systems that we find ourselves working with more commonly now than hardware directed or hardware intensive systems. So you see that design of experiments is one of the technologies that we're really trying to advance in terms of our capability. So this is the system or system of systems that we looked at. It's the Navy command control type of underlying system. You see it there up the top underneath the title is really all the different systems that are coming together, not just command and control, but intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, the weather, meteorological, the oceanographic information, and then signal intelligence, all working together, all being communicated across either shore systems, as you can see there, the buildings on the land, and then the sea systems, right? The carriers, the destroyers, and so forth. So we call those platforms generally in the military, the carrier or the destroyer, and we'll talk about those as we go forward. But look at that list of acronyms there. Those are all separate systems that are going through various different stages of acquisition. Maybe they've been around for a while and they're getting upgrades to their software or capabilities, but all those have programs. Each one of those is a program, and they need to work well together. So there's our challenge. And we apply experimental design using the traditional approach. Doug has in his first chapter, right, the 7-step approach to experimental design. And that's being captured here. You look at it as sort of a 4-phase plan, design, execute, analyze, and sub-steps within there, of course, as well. And recognizing that it's not just how many tests and factors for planning, it is quite involved. And as a matter of fact, the next slide's trying to show you, you know, when we start thinking about those 7 steps and we start thinking about details, it's the details that do matter. And so what Greg actually is on I think I saw earlier, Greg Hutto and I worked on a paper about, I don't know, 8 years ago or so, where we kind of laid out this series of checklists that we want to go through when we plan and design and execute and analyze experimental design. But these are the kinds of things that we're thinking about. So we get those different programs of record on board and say, okay, we're going to do an integrated test, a system of systems test. And what you see here in blue inside each one of the rectangles are some of the things that we found immediately as challenges. So we knew that we wanted a minimum of 4 of these systems, optimal to have 6 of them working together in a system of systems environment. And lo and behold, 2 or 3 of them right off the bat say, I'm not so interested, maybe. The time isn't right. We don't have the available resources. And oh, by the way, who's going to pay for this test that we're doing? So hurdles galore right from the outset. And that's just the planning side of the house. When we start thinking about the experimental design part of it, as we'll see, we're going to emphasize this for the rest of the talk, is that we have many factors, generally speaking. And some of the systems will share factors, but they may not share levels necessarily of the factors. But so we need to sort of address that type of reality when we're starting to plan this experiment. And ultimately what we want, and this is really just a general term of goodness, but design quality and design metrics that we look at, there are many of those, and we'd like to have the design for the system level as good as for each one of the systems as we can describe for the overall system of systems. Simultaneous execution, so where the systems that come into play and they got to say ready, set, go, all the systems need to be ready to be operating and so forth, right? Other execution challenges, and then gathering the data at the end of the day, pulling it all together and trying to see what's going on. So as we work through this case study, I'll be showing you essentially by example. We'll dumb it down a little bit, simplify it so we can go through and see some of the details. And we'll go through the design part, spend a little more time on design and a little less on the analysis, but we will cover that as well. So what is characteristic, or what is sort of part and parcel of a system of systems experimental design scenario? What you see in the blue shaded rectangle there is really what we're trying to capture is a system of systems. And the white squares inside of the blue rectangle are showing you, it's listed as a subsystem, but it really is a system in and of itself. It's a program of record, it's ICOP, or it's GCGSN or CANES, or whatever the acronym of the day or system of the day that we're really focusing on. Those systems are connected in various different ways or fashions. And so the lines connecting them are just showing you how they work together. And then on the far left-hand side of the blue rectangle, you see about 10 factors that capture all the factors that are associated. And you see 4 responses over there on the right-hand side. Very, very simplistic view of what we find in reality. And then what we're seeing in the zoom in at the bottom of the slide is that, for a given system that we'll call subsystem 3, we have 3 factors and 2 responses. Subsystem 4 has 4 factors and 2 responses. And it turns out that there's overlap. It looks like factor 1, if I can read it, is common to subsystem 3 and subsystem 4. So that's what we're facing when we're planning and designing this particular experiment. So that's one more realistic example. So I'm going to take it down a notch and say we really only just have 3 systems that we're studying. 2 of them what we call hosted. They're on may or may not be on a ship, but it's part of this network. And then we've got some system that's connected to the network. We're going to look at, in this example, 6 total factors. And those factors may or may not be a part of each individual system. We're going to call it H1 for hosted 1, H2 for hosted 2, and C1 for connected 1. And then 3 responses. When I get to the analysis, I think we simplified it and brought it all down to just a single response to show you how we do the analysis in a system of systems environment. So taking a look at that first picture, that's what we have over on the left. And now I'm zooming in to show you of those 6 factors, how they are allocated across systems. So remember A through F, so 6 factors, 4 of those 6 are involved in system 1 or hosted 1, A, B, D, and F. And then we have 3 each for hosted 2 and connected 1. And you see now that, for instance, factor A is a part of each one of the systems. Factor F is a part of only one system. Okay. And this is actually how we ended up working responses. We essentially had a time to complete for hosted 1, a time to complete for hosted 2, and a time to complete for connected 1 are the 3 different responses. A little bit more detail on the factors to make it a little more realistic for this particular example. Saturation has to do with the network, and platform A might be an aircraft carrier, platform B might be a destroyer. And then we have other network types of characteristics associated with bandwidth and file size and so forth. Right, and then the responses down below, time to complete a task on the 3 individual systems with a anticipated range of response values. All right, so ready, set, go, build a design, right? And it's not so trivial. One thing that you're going to be learning throughout this course is there are many different design choices. And probably you're early enough on in the course, or the topic is early enough in the course where you've learned about the 2-level factorial design. And that's what we're showing there in the top center, is that 3-factor, 2-level, 8-run design. And showing you in the terms of the geometry that Doug has in his textbook, and then showing you what it looks like in a table just beside it. It's not the only design that's out there. We have a whole bunch of different types of designs we could consider, but it really is driven by the factors and the number of runs that we have available generally. So the first one we're actually going to look at is this fractional factorial design. But let me talk a little bit about how we went about building the design. First and foremost, and Doug emphasizes this throughout the text, and he's been a big champion of this, is sequential strategy, meaning we don't just throw out one design and hope that that's going to solve all of our problems. What we generally do is build and execute a first design, and then based on what we learn from analysis of that, or the data from that execution of that design, we then go and execute a follow-on test that builds upon the information that we had from the first test. Sequential strategy of experimentation. The other point, the second bullet, is exactly what we ended up doing in terms of building a design for system of systems. And that was to take all of our factors, right? In this case, we have 6 factors, and we decided to build a design for the 6 factors and then subset that design for each one of the systems. And we'll do that by example. We'll show you what we're talking about here in a minute. And actually, this is an attempt to show what's going on there. So say we have a 20-run experimental design, 6 factors, A through F. The -1, right, is low setting. The +1 is the high setting. The 0 is the middle setting. So you see that we have extreme points or vertices that we're using in runs 1 and 2, and then like a center point for run 3 and so forth, all the way down to the 20 runs. That's our base design. And then what we're going to do is extract what that design is in terms of 4 of the factors, A, B, D, and F. And that's my system 1 or hosted 1 design. What does that design look like in 20 runs? And then take it to the next level and look at system 2, which is A, C, and E. Now just 3 factors, 20 runs. What is going on with that design? And then finally, I think it's A, B, and C for that 3rd system. So this is one possible strategy for experimentation. Another one would be to build the system level designs and then try to see what that looks like pieced together when we have some overlapping factors and some that are not necessarily overlapping factors. Turned out that the approach that we took ended up working quite nicely because we were very efficient in the 6 factor 2-level design. We built a fractional factorial design. And in fractional factorial design, generally you're going to find yourself with aliasing, right? Correlations between some of the effects. And in this case, we're using a jump correlation color map. And the main diagonal here in red shows the factors correlation or the effects correlated with themselves. And then anything in the off diagonals that is other than the sea of blue is correlated and extremely correlated, right? In this case, perfectly correlated. And so by example, I'm showing you one there that's A, B, and E, F are perfectly correlated. That's not something that generally you'd want to have in a design where we don't have many phases to it. In this case, we had 2 phases, the first set of runs and the second set of runs. But if we go to the system level designs now, what ends up happening is for each one of the system level designs, they're actually full factorials, right? It was a fractional factorial and the system of systems, but where we do the analysis is at the system level and where we do the assessment of the design at the system level. So what we have are full factorials and 4 factors and 3 factors and 3 factors in this particular, using this particular approach with good statistical power and excellent correlation setup. And then, oh, by the way, what we end up doing is planning for a second phase if needed, based upon the analysis of the first phase. And a natural next phase is to build runs in there so that we can estimate the second order effects, the quadratic effects. And here we're just showing some goodness in regards to 2 different alternative approaches. One is to add axial points for like a central composite design. And the other is to add runs using an optimality criterion, like I optimality. And so we compare the 2, one for power and the other for prediction variance, which we typically do those kinds of things for a second order design, and ended up picking the winner, which is the one that had some optimal runs with it. Same number of total runs, 12 additional runs to 20 to give us 32 total. And that's the approach that we took. What we find when we look at correlations now with some additional points is sometimes we have something other than no correlation or perfect correlation. You get some degree of correlation. Doug has done some work over the years in these no confounding designs where you have some correlation present. And that's typically what you find when we start looking at goodness of designs. And so we looked at the correlations of the I-optimal augmentation versus the axial augmentation and found overall better situation, you know, not the pinks in there, but the grays and the light grays in terms of the correlations going on. So that is something we run into quite often, is a nice 2-stage approach, running the first stage for main effects and 2-factor interaction, second stage for the second order terms. But then we find that reality comes up and grabs us again and says, well, some of these factors aren't necessarily easy to change, associated with the saturation of the network. That's going to take 2 hours to get set up to change that factor. And so now it becomes hard to change. Now we have a split plot world. So what about that in terms of our system of systems situation? Here we're just showing 4 total factors. A and B in this case are hard to change. C and D are easy to change. And so we're going to a corner of the bigger square or rectangle and setting up with a fixed setting for A and B and running some runs in random order of C and D. So it's a different approach to experimental design. And so we have to think about that differently when we go to assessing the designs, to building these designs. But we took the same strategy and said, we've had 6 factors. Now we have to think about something called whole plots and subplots, and how many whole plots and how many total runs. So this was just one scenario with some number of whole plots. Let's see if I can move this over so I can see what I'm missing in terms of the title. I think it was 6 whole plots in this particular scenario. And then we looked at another scenario where we increased slightly the number of whole plots. And you see that from less whole plots to more whole plots, we get better correlations and we get better power values. Okay. And so we ended up going with a little more in terms of whole plots. It takes more time to test every time we add a whole plot, but it's that trade-off in terms of goodness of the design versus the time it takes to test. And then for the phase 2 of the split plot, same kind of deal. We're looking at, how many whole plots do we need and how many total runs do we need? So we looked at mostly just the number of whole plots. We looked at 10 total whole plots versus 13 total whole plots by adding phase 1 and the additional runs we added for phase 2, and saw that the 13 whole plot design actually was much better, both for power, prediction variance, and for the correlations. So that was an easy call in terms of that, and it ended up being something that was practical to implement. So it was not a big problem. Okay, looking at my time, I've got here about maybe 5 minutes or so remaining, and that's actually
That's fine.
Perfect for going through the analysis. Thanks, Doug. Yeah, going through the analysis. Once we have executed something like this, we're going to start with and we're going to start and finish with just a completely randomized design. Assume that was executed. What do we do in terms of analysis? How do we handle that maybe differently now that we have multiple systems that we're considering? And the answer is, well, let's take it a system at a time, analyze that system, and try to build a statistical model that well characterizes the underlying system that's present. What better way in a case study than to simulate the data and see how well we did with the simulated data, knowing that the underlying truth was that we have main effect associated with A, B, D, and F. We have an A-B interaction that's present and big. We've got D now in terms of a quadratic term that's pretty big in terms of the second order effect. And then we've got other things going on in terms of blocking and noise magnitude. So that's the truth, that we simulate that data with noise and went through analysis first of phase 1. Remember, if phase 1 had the corner points and the axial points, the corner points and the center points. And we found that with the center points, there was some curvature present. So as a result, we went to phase 2, analyzed phase 2, and found that, hey, lo and behold, we could find the underlying main effects. We found the 2-factor interaction, which is AB right here in the jump output, and found the D squared term at the end of the day through the analysis of the data from that particular design, simulated data, of course. And then we present the results, and maybe one way to present the results is to show that the shaded areas, the light pink, are infeasible combinations of time to complete the task. And right here in the white shaded, the clear and the sort of that band that curves around in the center are good response values, satisfactory response values. And so we look at combinations of inputs that give us better overall performance. So that's how we'd use it at a system level. This is looking at hosted 2, which is that second response, connected 1, which is a third response, and then bringing them together and saying, okay, if I want to look at my first response, which is the time to connect to execute for the first system, and then we've got the second system with the profile and a third system with the profiler, we can pull all that together and say, I want overall goodness for all my systems simultaneously. because this is all integrated. And all three of these systems need to be functional in my systems. So that's a standard approach. We call it multiple response optimization. And there's a desirability approach that's been around right since the 1970s, Doug, and has been really, really, really successful, valuable approach. But then JUMP gives us the ability to take that type of situation and lay those system responses one on top of one another, build a contour plot, and find a region of that input space. We're just looking at A and B right now, where all three of the responses are satisfied. Top left, essentially quadrant of the input space in A and B. And why do we pick A and B to start? Well, maybe they're the dominant factors, right? They had two big main effects and they had an interaction associated with them. So pick your dominant factors and plot that first. And that would be something that the audience can absorb and process and make decisions based upon some of these factors. And I think that was essentially it in terms of this particular example, this case study, applying standard experimental design approaches. Most of what I've talked about here is fairly standard design of experiments approaches, but we have to apply it in a unique way in order to accomplish our objective, which is to satisfy multiple systems, multiple experimental designs being run simultaneously. And as you see from the second bullet there's plenty of research to do to improve upon this or think about it more and solve more of the real problems that are associated with this type of reality that we face. All right, over to comments or questions at this point.
Well, Jim, let me first of all thank you for this presentation. This is really interesting, and my guess is that in the DoD world, these system of system tests are pretty common.
Yes, sir.
Because almost all of the platforms that I'm familiar with have common elements, typically software, and
right.
And figuring out how to construct and execute designs in that environment is clearly a challenging problem. I can think of for example, one problem that I would struggle with and have to think about a lot is if you have two platforms that have a common factor, but you have different ranges for those factors on the different platforms. I don't know how common that would be, but that would seem to present kind of a serious challenge in terms of how you would handle that. The only way I could think about handling that would be to make that single factor two factors with
right.
With ranges for factor A on this system being on this subsystem being different ranges for that factor on the different subsystem. But I mean, there's a lot of challenging issues here.
Yep, that's sort of just like your classic nested factor approach, right?
Yeah.
Where the levels of the particular factor depend upon the setting of another factor, which might be system in this case.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I can just see possibly some different ways to handle that. And it would be I think it'd be kind of challenging to find the right strategies to do that. And of course, in a lot of these tests, at least from what I've seen, a significant additional challenge is just the total number of runs that you can use. If you didn't have serious constraints on the number of runs, you could maybe use some different strategies. But it's often very difficult in these types of experiments to get more than 20 or 25 runs.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Runs can be very time consuming, particularly if it's destructive type of testing, right? Where we're launching a missile or dropping a bomb and that kind of thing. So yeah,
right,
absolutely.
And then there's the problem of follow-up testing. If you run an experiment and you discover based on the analysis that you need to do some follow-up testing, maybe to either resolve ambiguities because of aliasing or to account for quadratic effects, you suddenly discover that the facilities that you need to run this experiment are no longer available. So, like the guys out at Edwards Air Force Base say, well, yeah, you can have more range time, but we're fully booked for the next 8 months.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why I got interested in these no confounding designs that you briefly mentioned, because they're alternatives to standard fractionals where you don't have complete aliasing of main effects and two-factor interactions or two-factor interactions with each other.
Right.
And sometimes they enable you to run more factors in a smaller design and still be able to untangle the effects. Carly Metcalf, who for those of you that have been around in Fireside Chats from the beginning, Carly was one of the first guests on the Fireside Chat, and her doctoral dissertation here was devoted to figuring out the best way to analyze those types of designs, because it turns out that some of the things that you think might work, like stepwise regression, are not always the best way to do it. And so there's this whole topic that you've brought up is just full of questions that need, we need to get another 6 or 7 PhD students working on this stuff, because these are non-trivial problems. And I suspect that the DoD runs into these on a very regular basis.
Yeah, I need to even more, right? Because the system integrated testing just isn't done nearly as much as it needs to be done. And when it is done, it's done right at the very end when a failing decision is imminent. And so we're after this. So,
and I suspect these kinds of problems also occur in civilian situations as well.
Oh yeah.
The military applications are pretty obvious, but I'm sure there are plenty of civilian systems that could benefit from this kind of research.
Yeah, I had a couple of slides in the backup that were talking about testing for cybersecurity systems, right? So that's that goes across the gamut.
That covers everything from the military to the civilian world and all the way back around again. So
yeah.
So we have some questions that have come in, and this was actually a question that was submitted for the Fireside Chat in August, but we didn't get it until afterwards. And so Jim, this is a really interesting question, and I would like to get you to chime in on this as well. Let me read the question. Okay. I am planning an experiment with 10 factors. Antibiotics, some very weak with no effect, some moderate, and 2 very strong antibiotics. And I want to study their interaction or combined effects on cytotoxicity level. He says he has no experience in design of experiments, very little knowledge of statistics. Okay, well, that's for the person that asked this question. You are the audience for which this MOOC is intended. Okay, and if you persevere, we can solve that problem, because if you work your way through the MOOC, you'll become knowledgeable enough to be able to do some pretty sophisticated experiments. So how can I easily proceed with my experimental design, and how can I analyze the results without going much deeper in the statistical jargon? Join the course to learn about DOE, but after 2 weeks, it already feels overwhelming for me. Okay, thanks. I understand the sense of being overwhelmed. In the MOOC, we sort of assume that you've had some prior exposure to statistics, maybe an introductory methods class that you took somewhere in college. But for a lot of people, that was a couple of eons ago, and you've forgotten everything that they taught you. And the course might have been taught by some disinterested guy who had no idea about how you were ever going to use it. My experience has been that introductory general statistics courses are among the worst taught courses in universities. but I mean, they really are, because a lot of times the people that teach them have absolutely no clue about what the people that are taking the course are going to do with it. And statistics is one of those things that you need a context, I think, in order to really get involved. So let's talk about this. Okay. And Jim, feel free to jump in here, because your thoughts on this are I'm sure going to be very useful. 10 factors is a lot of factors. Okay. And it sounds like you have some idea about the relative importance or strength of the factors. So one strategy that could be employed here would be to run an initial experiment with fewer than 10 factors. Let's say pick out the 4 or 5 factors that you think have the strongest effects. Okay. And then I would think about running either a 16 run 4-factor 2 to the 4 design, or a 16 run 5-factor half fraction, because that would enable you to estimate the main effects of all of those factors and all of the 2-factor interactions. And that would be a design that would give you a lot of good information. Then for a next phase, what you might do is you might drop some of the factors that maybe were less important in that first experiment and add some of the ones that you didn't include in the original experiment. So you can sort of do a mix and match and run a series of experiments to get an understanding of how these factors operate. That's one strategy. What do you think of that, Jim? Does that seem like a reason?
No, you're doing, your first step was very similar to what I would recommend, which is see if there's a way to cull down the number of factors. It can be daunting, right? Because we don't know at the end of the day which ones really are.
That's right.
Going to be influential at the end of the day. So I wouldn't write those other 5 off necessarily, but knowing that would be a reasonable place to start. Pick the ones that are most influential in your mind, the ones that have the biggest chance to affect the outcome. So one thing that I grabbed a hold of when the question was read was that, 2 days through the course and you're overwhelmed, and now you're not really armed with the ability to build that design or do the analysis at the end of the day. So I'd recommend, there's so much online in terms of these tutorials and webinars and free classes from probably folks that are more than interested in teaching this kind of thing that you can get for free. And then together with that, I would recommend that you pick a project that isn't necessarily work related, that is a homegrown project that you are interested in. I'm grading my grad students projects right now. So we've got catapult launches, paper airplanes. How many bubbles do you blow out of some formulary? How high does a ball bounce? Back and forth. There's all kinds of stuff going on. Or you can get more complex in terms of UPC and whether your backup lasts a long time. But anyway, that would be a great way to get up to speed, is by a practical example. And 4 or 5 factors, what Doug was mentioning with the full factorial or a half fraction in 5 factors, perfect initial design to work with and to get experience with. And then, reach out, I would guess, and recommend too, if you get stuck with the analysis, to somebody that would be willing to help you walk through the analysis of the data. And that would take all of 20 minutes to do, something like that.
This was a point that I've wanted to also make, Jim, is that I think it's pretty clear that this person is working in an organization of some kind. And right. I would reach out to people in that organization to see if there are some individuals there that have some experience or knowledge of designed experiments.
Right.
Even if they're not in your specific field, very often you'll find that these folks have the knowledge that you need to help you plan the experiment and analyze it. So look for help in your own organization as a starter.
Yeah.
But I think that's a really good way to get started, is think sequentially and build up the knowledge about these factors as you go along. That's assuming that you can run some reasonable number of experiments. If these things
Right.
cost $100,000 each, then we have another problem.
Right.
Okay, here is a question for Jim from the Zoom chat. And can you read this, Jim, or do you want me to read it to you?
About the feedback?
He can't read them. Okay, here's the question. It says, with the segmented nature of the overall design, do residual analysis and interpretation pose special problems? That is, diagnosing causes of outliers, for example.
Great question. So the segmented nature of the experimentation, if we're talking about the two phases, right? So that's a natural addition of a block effect that we would want to incorporate. And that would really help out in terms of those residuals behaving more like each other if that nuisance factor is incorporated. So that shouldn't be a big problem. And generally speaking, good for you for thinking through the residual analysis, and particularly the outliers, that type of thing. You really want to be mindful of that. Take advantage of time at the end of the day. Oh, we're all done. You can go home. No, you can't go home. There's a couple of points we'd like you to rerun because they look really spurious. So yeah, take advantage of those opportunities.
Yeah, this is, I think, a really good question. And I think this is another area where there may be opportunities for some new research work. How to actually, are there some special residual analysis methods that could be used? So, okay, here's another question for you. Said, what feedback did you get from the customer on this clever and novel approach? Did they comprehend what you had done?
Thank you, Greg.
Oh,
so
this Greg Hutto?
Yes.
Hey,
yes.
How are you, Greg?
We actually see him on camera. At least I do.
Okay.
So awesome. Yeah. So
great. Thank you.
As you know, what ends up happening is you get mixed reactions depending upon their level of interest and their knowledge statistically, and usually that knowledge base is pretty shallow. So what we end up finding is, I had a champion for this, so that champion was all over what we were about and what we were doing, and so it was, at the end of the day, that was the way we were going to go. And so that was, I think, very, very well received that way. But as you saw with some of the frustrations that we experienced, some of the folks that were there and present in that command control room, they were not excited about being there. They didn't think that this was a fun little exercise. And so they would get distracted from time to time. And so they had to be called out by the test director a couple of times to say, hey, pay attention here. We got, you're up next, or whatever it is. And so we're a little bit disappointed, to be honest, at the end of the day with the data that we did receive. Some spurious data, put it that way.
That's kind of too bad, really, because I would have hoped that the operators involved in this thing would have seen the potential.
Yes.
Because I think this is a very novel way to deal with a kind of an ugly problem, actually.
So that's a great point, but what ended up happening is just sort of a breakdown between the program level folks that really knew the underlying system. We needed them there, but they didn't have the support at the system level. There was support at the system level, but they didn't have support at the system level to go forth and do it. So that was the breakdown, I think, that we experienced.
Yeah, that's too bad.
Too
bad. Okay, here is another question from Greg, a follow-up on the residuals question. Factor A is varied in systems 1 and 2, and maybe residuals are unusual for factor A. Which system contributed?
So what we end up doing, good question as
Yeah.
well. What we end up doing is we analyze each individual system with factor A and look at the residuals for system 1 and see what's going on there. And then we look at that same factor, how it plays in system 2, and look at the residuals there. So we have the opportunity to isolate residuals. Now, what we didn't do was have the responses overlap, right? We had a single response for each system. But what if the responses are a function of multiple systems? Great question now. Who are we going to pin that large residual on? If we end up getting a large residual, do that response. So there's some more research that can be done.
Is that a place where maybe you would do another run or maybe a pair of runs?
Yeah.
To see whether something really unusual happened in one of those systems that contributed to, because one of the things that I've always sort of suggested to people when you have an unusual observation, which is what causes the unusual residual, is think about, is it something that you should consider doing that run again, just to make sure that the results that you got weren't completely wacky.
Yeah, absolutely. And then take advantage, like you said, of rerunning. When we rerun that, let's come up with some secondary responses that we can tag to the individual systems now to see the culprit maybe.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Okay, question from the Zoom chat. When running design experiments, do you typically use SAS only? Is there a time that you use SAS and R together? And if the answer is yes, in which scenarios do you use both? Good question. I think we can both talk about this.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I never use R. Okay. You couldn't pay me enough money to use R. Okay. Because R requires programming, and I don't want to write programs. Okay. I don't teach R in any of my classes, and we don't talk about R in here. Why? Well, there are a lot of organizations that will not let you use open source software on their computing platforms for a variety of reasons. And R is open source, and that is a problem. If you work in a regulated industry, if the FDA, for example, is your regulator, the FDA has approved software. R is not on the list, okay, and it probably never will be because it's open source. SAS, I used to use SAS a lot. I don't anymore because I have found that all of the functionality that I need in designed experiments is available in either JMP or Minitab. And so I tend to use those platforms because again, they don't require me to write any code. It's fill in the blanks in the dialog boxes, and you can do anything you want. Both Minitab and JMP also have what we think of as scripting languages. And so you can actually write Minitab macros, and you can write JMP scripts to do just about anything that you want. In fact, my research students typically use the JMP scripting language, although I have had at least one PhD student, Edgar Hassler, who was also a guest in the Fireside chat. He used R and Python in doing some of his preliminary research, but then in the end, he ended up doing almost everything with Jump. So that's my take on it. But that's just me. Okay. So Jim, what do you think? What are your thoughts on software?
So I've experienced pretty much the full gamut from my work with different organizations. So I think it depends, really applies strongly here. I agree with all of what Doug has said. But let me just share a little bit more in regards to what's out there, what's available, and what works. My experience with R has been very positive. I did it used it for my dissertation. So goes way back, and I've taught courses now in R regression course and a DOE-based course in R. So I'm not that great of a coder, but I still see incredible benefits to using something like R. So what ends up happening, and here's why, what ends up happening with a lot of organizations now is they get budget tight on software budget purchasing. And so, and especially true in the military. So we don't have money for Jump. We don't have money for SAS. Sorry, you're on your own. Now, less expensive, Minitab and Design Expert, both great, very, very, very capable. I tend to favor Design Expert actually over most of the softwares.
I should have mentioned them, Jim. They're also a very good package.
Yep, very quick to learn, right? And so somebody that's just getting into it, you're going to pick it up right away. But yeah, so one of my colleagues that I've worked with over the years that has adopted R, just back to R for one last minute, is they adopted R because they tend to do experimental design on systems time and again. So although a very broad breadth of systems, that system will come up every 2 or 3 years. And so he loves the script that he can just pull right up from all the work he did the time before and maybe make a few edits and hit the go button on it. And it's got tremendous capability, as we know R does. Python more popular nowadays, but both very, very similar. And we're finding that, again, I'm feeling old, but because I am, but it's you know, those that are say 40 and younger, just they pick up this coding seems to be very quickly.
Yeah.
And it's not intimidating to them. It's not a challenge, and they are quite capable with it. So just a plug for all the softwares.
Well, you know, you mentioned your colleague that saves his R script. You know, you can do that with Jump also.
Yeah, it's just the scripting is a lot easier to do in R than it is in.
But when you run an experiment in Jump, one of the options is to save the script.
Sure.
And
Absolutely.
so if you run that same experiment again with different factors or responses, you can when you get to the analysis, you can say run script, and it will reproduce the analysis that you did last time. So yeah, there are a lot of options out there, and I got to admit I'm kind of prejudiced because I don't like to write code. I don't trust myself. But my students write code, and they use R and Python and you know, in some of the development work on their research. So these are all useful products. They all have potentially good uses.
Agreed.
Okay, we are running out of time here. We're just about ready to have to pull the plug. That's the end of questions. The next Fireside Chat is Wednesday, October 13th. And my guest is somebody who's got really an interesting speaker, Maria Weiss of Miami University in Ohio. And we're going to give more information about this, about her talk. She's done some really interesting work in experimental design, and she's a great speaker, and I think you'll really enjoy Maria. Jim, thank you very much.
Thank you.
For this talk, and I appreciate all the people that signed on for the chat. And tell people about this. I mean, this is something that we have a lot of fun doing, and we'd like to have more people participate.